Subject to Interpretation, a podcast which takes us deep into the topics that matter to professional interpreters. I'm your host, Maria Ceballos Wallis. Interpreters encounter multiple instances of ethical and professional dilemmas during their day-to-day practice. Today, we're going to talk about these experiences in the medical setting. They are known as critical incidents. To learn about this subject and a recently launched tool intended to help interpreters learn from the experience of others, we've invited Natalya Mytareva to Subject to Interpretation. Natalya is the executive director and one of the founding commissioners of the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters, CCHI. CCHI is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to develop and administer national certification programs for healthcare interpreters. Natalya is also a CoreCHI working in Russian and English, and previously an instructor of interpretation, translation, and linguistics at Volgograd State University in Russia, and also at Kent State University in the United States. Welcome, Natalya.
Well, Maria, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this important topic. I'm truly grateful and excited.
Well, we're happy to have you here. Let's start by asking you, what is a critical incident and why is this important?
Well, a critical incident is a concept taken up from the healthcare settings, where doctors, nurses, all allied professions are required to report any incident when a patient suffers harm. And there are different degrees of harm and criticality of those incidents. So what we thought at CCHI is important because we are an equal member of the team that treats the patient and it communicates with their family, that we need to be mindful of the situations when we interpreters feel that there was something in the communication that didn't go quite well or that caused us some distress. It's one of those moments when I think of it as, your gut feeling like, did I do it right? Did I really say it? So those are the moments that we want to capture so that we can then collectively ponder, discuss, and come up with solutions in terms of either pointing them out, like in these situations, if you're a novice interpreter, even if you're an experienced interpreter, you may experience some discomfort and this is what you should do, or maybe even provide special trainings, special scripts on how to deal with those moments that we encounter. But first we need to collect them to figure out what are those moments, incidents in communication where we feel either doubt, frustration, anxiety, or maybe satisfaction and thinking like, oh, that went so well, I need to tell the world about this. So that's what, in a nutshell, what we think of when we say critical incidents.
Now, how do interpreters generally deal with critical incidents? What are some of the ways that either a staff medical interpreter or a freelance medical interpreter might deal with either one of these incidents of satisfaction or dissatisfaction?
Well, as you know, in the field, there are usually, two broad options. One option is you come to the supervisor to debrief, or you come to, a meeting. If it's a staff interpreter, they usually have staff meetings where you bring something up. But I think the most common one is what we've done for decades, which is discuss with your peers, discuss with the fellow interpreters, because I do believe that interpreters do not discuss this with their family members, friends, etc. So I think we're beyond that professionally, that we understand that we should seek advice and we do it within our fellow interpreters. However, we believe that these discussions are often not captured or not captured appropriately. Like in the past, before pandemic, majority of us were interacting face to face. So we discussed it at conferences or get-togethers. Now we tend to discuss the situations in social media groups, and all the richness of the discussion sometimes is lost for being a learning lesson to others.
So let's talk about Facebook, for example, because there are a lot of forums on Facebook, and these can be very useful and they can be very supportive for interpreters. Sometimes the questions are, hey, I need help in interpreting this phrase in this context. And that's always very interesting because no matter where you're from, it's always nice to hear different options and different versions that other interpreters come up with. But when an interpreter has one of these critical situations happen, then and they post it on Facebook, what risk do they run?
Well, there's several things. One is because this is Facebook, sometimes we feel very comfortable and we forget about the privacy of our patients and providers and your own, right? So you're exposing on Facebook because you have your identity there. You're exposing already maybe too much of the context of your question. And your employer, or both either a facility, a hospital, or a language company, may be monitoring Facebook, and they may see that you have overstated the identifiable personal information that you should not disclose. In other words, you violate a HIPAA. So that's the number one kind of legal and professional challenge with sharing things on Facebook. Now, the second aspect of why I think sometimes these conversations may be not quite satisfying is that anybody could comment, right? And including individuals who call themselves interpreters but have not invested in the profession through going through the training, through certification. In other words, you may get an advice that has not been vetted and is not correct. And because it's Facebook, such groups on social media are usually closed, and they're monitored for normal things like um, decency of the conversation, respect, but they're not monitored for the actual content. Uh, how would you know that you're getting good advice, right? It's similar to we still have interpreters say, I've been doing it for 20 years, and then they fail a certification exam. That may mean that you may have been doing it wrong for 20 years. So same challenge, and I feel exists with the social media posts like that, because they're simply not meant to be a professional forum for mediation or arbitrage. They're still just social media.
Now, I find that the comments and the responses that are most useful to me are those that are grounded in a clear understanding of the code of ethics that underpins the question that the person is asking. Uh, Obviously, many people are responding, while they have 5 minutes at the supermarket, or they might be giving an opinion. So there's really no way to curate these answers and these responses in a way that prioritizes those answers that are grounded in the code of ethics and professional responsibility, until you create a program like the one that CCHI is trying to create, right?
Well, that's the intent. We really curating and providing the input that is grounded in the code of ethics, in the practice, and in the emerging best practices, right? That's the challenge when you deal with the changing world and with communication. Before COVID-19, we didn't dream that we would do certain things, right? Our main challenge was leave the room, don't be alone with the patient. And now it is, what do I do with my webcam, right? Do I turn it off? Do I turn it on, right? So so there are different types, and they evolve. So we cannot have it once and for all decided that this is the right thing to do. And what we should, as a profession, embrace is the tool that exists for medical professionals, which is rounds, right? When they discuss cases and they learn during the treatment of a specific case how this could be applied to future cases. And because these cases sometimes sometimes are not ready yet for peer-reviewed medical publications, but in the facility they're discussed, especially when you do Schwartz rounds and you have multidisciplinary discussions from social workers, the clinical team, and interpreters could come in at that moment. So if we have these virtual rounds, and now that we're all virtual, it's actually a perfect time when we have critical incidents that are submitted to us for review, and we publish them on our website, and then we can invite a panel of experts representing different stakeholders, which would be your practicing interpreters who are experienced, who have shown their dedication to the profession, who are certified interpreter trainers, maybe medical healthcare providers of different kinds, like doctors, nurses, social workers, and discuss that incident from all these three perspectives. And eventually, I hope we could also invite somebody to represent patients or the public so that they could also chime in, because sometimes we need to deal with communication issues, not just from within interpreting, but know all the other perspectives while applying our professional standards and code of ethics. So that's the idea. When we have a good enough sample of incidents, we'll have the first virtual rounds. And I already talked to several experts in the field who are eager and willing and are on standby to get ready with. We just need to get this project off the ground and have more people contribute to it.
So walk us through the process of contributing to this new initiative.
Well, you go to our website, cchicertification.org, and on the bottom of the homepage, there is a link that takes you to that process. It's a report. It's an online form. And in the form, we try to kill so many birds with one stone that it is really, robust. So we ask for some demographic information that would be eventually analyzed and reported in an aggregate manner in terms of who are the interpreters practicing, who are the ones who contribute with languages, where they work, that kind of stuff. Because we don't know whether these reports will come from staff interpreters or freelancers, or whether they'll all be from Spanish interpreters, or will have the richness of different cultures and languages. So, but we will keep track of it, and we hope that annual will be publishing reports that will show us how active our profession is, because we need to keep a record, online record of our profession, and this is one of these kind of byproducts of that initiative. But the bulk of that online form is the actual description of the critical incident, and then your reflection, your as the interpreter reflection on that incident, and your suggestions, your assessments, whether it was good, whether it was whether you applied all you wanted, or if you needed to think through it in the future, make some changes to your behavior in similar situations. So those are the kind of the intent. So we hope, and we know from the couple of people who submitted the reports, that it takes about 50 to 60 minutes to complete that online form, because we truly need you to think through, to look up the codes of ethics so that you can back up your decisions either in that moment or your proposed solutions with the actual existing recommendations. Or if you cannot find anything in the code of ethics or the standard of practice, then propose the solution of how we should address that. The form has several parts, and before submitting the form, we encourage everyone to read on our website the critical incident report guidelines, because that's the documents. It's a short document, and it defines for you the 5 elements of the report, and especially confidentiality when you submit your scenario. Because ultimately, when you describe your incident, it's important that you keep it very specific, so we don't have to, so we can give specific feedback, but it should not disclose any identifiable health information or business information about the facility that is engaged in it, because we anticipate reports could be about different things, including one of the parties handling the situation. And we don't want anybody, including CCHI or the panelists who will do the virtual rounds, to get in trouble by discussing something. So that's why we have those guidelines about confidentiality, how you can blur some elements. For example, if the real incident involved a 2-year-old boy from hospital XYZ, what you will tell us, it will be a 3.5-year-old girl from a rural hospital. And then nobody will know what you're talking about, especially when we publish these reports. We further de-identified by removing your name, obviously. And if the language is mentioned in the report, if it's important, then we keep it. And if it is not, and we also, like the preliminary review of our staff includes the fact that if we see something that we think may be too close to identifying something, then we also would blur it even more before we publish it on our website.
Now, I find it very interesting that this tool, the process that one follows, can actually be a process that we as interpreters can adopt in our own self-evaluation and reflection of incidents, perhaps not necessarily a critical incident, but those of us who routinely review our work, we review the situations that we encounter ourselves in. This really presents a very, very useful framework, especially the section in which you have to match and identify the conflict together with a code of ethics that you think is being infringed upon.
Yes, absolutely. And right now we only have 2 reports published. And in one of those, the first one, I appreciate the actual self-reflection moment that the interpreter took when he filled out that. And in that moment, it was a she. In that moment, like, we asked the specific questions, like, what were your thoughts and assumptions during and after the incident? Right? Or what were your feelings during and after an incident? Because assumptions and feelings, right, are different things, right? What did you do in connection with that incident, and why is it critical to you, right? Because what we're looking for, it could be something very simple. I did not interpret part of the statement, but why? And why did you feel that you want to go through this process and fill out this paper? Because hopefully you are trying to either teach somebody something, or you yourself discovered that, you know what, this is one of my weaknesses, and I need to overcome it. And by filling out the report, when we put things in writing, right, the words start living their different life, their different reality, and then you review it before you click submit, and something happens in you that next time you're in the same situation, you most likely will pause and act in a different way than in the first time when you did it. So that self-reflecting moment, answering those questions, and that's another benefit of going through this process rather than just posting online. Online will usually throw things like, oh, this happened, what do you think? Well, here we ask you, like, what do you think first, right? And that is like, because we reach the point, especially when we do have so many years of experience, that we best learn by thinking and evaluating ourselves than actually just listening to a lecture, because we already have a lot to draw on internal. And I want interpreters to be empowered and understand that there is a learning moment in just filling out this self-reflection part of the critical incident report.
Now, let's take a look at let's talk about some of the reports that you have already online. Obviously, where this is an initial stage, so there isn't an actual, I guess, analysis of this. This hasn't been done by a group of experts, but it's sufficient to give us food for thought, isn't it? I think one of the interpreters who submitted a report was concerned that she omitted information unwittingly. Can we talk about that case?
Yes, I really appreciated that report, because that is so easy, especially if we get comfortable and we get experience, to start thinking that, well, this was a long segment of the patient, and we know the patient wants this, kind of assuming. And in this specific situation, as our listeners will read, it's a situation where a patient tells that she wants the provider to schedule a blood count test today, and the reason is so that she could see if there is continuous bleeding in the kidneys of her daughter. And so the interpreter, because she hears the urgency of the scheduling the appointment for the test, scheduling the test today, feels that that's the most important information, and forgets to mention about like the reason why. The reason is that there's possible continuous kidney bleeding, and that's after, the mother, luckily in this case, understands some English, and so she hears that the interpreter omitted that information, and she very graciously then reiterates, and could you please explain that the reason I'm asking for this test is because I want to check if there is bleeding. And then the interpreter catches, oh, she actually had two important key things, and I interpreted only one. And because of my not being very familiar with that specific case, with that specific patient, so I assumed that one thing was more important than the other. And the interpreter then proceeds through self-reflection and answering question is like, really need not to assume, take notes of everything, because when you see on the notes that you had complete, CBC and then continuous bleeding, you'll have to interpret those things because you see them in your notes. And that's the lesson that this interpreter learns. So not assuming things. It also could happen and does happen to many novice interpreters, because they, especially if they follow the same patient, they sometimes think that they can answer the questions for the patient, but they get into the same trap sometimes, because we cannot know what is important for the patient in this particular utterance, and it's not our job to figure out what's important for them. Our job is to listen, identify key elements of the meaning, and interpret key elements, and if you're lucky, all the other elements too, but the key elements all have to be interpreted of the meaning. So this, if we're looking at the mastery of accuracy, it's a continuum, and the minimum you start is with key elements, and then you add, other important elements, then you add secondary elements of that utterance. And so when you're a master, you interpret actually everything accurately, completely, without changing or substituting anything. But before you get to that mastery, at least the key elements. And it's hard to figure out, how do we force ourselves to do it every single time, every single utterance, without assuming. And I'm interested to, there's some suggestions that this interpreter makes in the report. I'll be interested to hear what the panelists decide of, like, how do we train that, right? How do we help people to remember about not assuming? So.
Now, Natalia, I also found it very interesting that this particular interpreter included background information on his or her work situation. And this particular interpreter was a telephonic interpreter who was working full time and who averaged about 20 calls of medical interpreting a day. I think it's very important that our listeners realize that critical incidents can happen in any scenario.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's kind of the richness, right, of this collecting all this information in a standardized manner, because we would capture that this is not just novice interpreter working the first week, or the person who does medical interpreting once in a once a year, right? So it is something that happens, and we need to figure out, why does it happen to this person? And would it happen to the other person? So maybe we'll have similar situation from a novice interpreter, and we'll discover that this happens for different reasons, right?
Absolutely. Now, there's also a second report that has already been published, and this one has to do with an in-person encounter where an interpreter was told not to interpret something, and they were conflicted because they had not done a pre-session. and they felt that they had compromised the situation and themselves by not having stated the guidelines in advance, which they felt, I think they were judging themselves pretty harshly, but
Mhm.
they felt that they had opened the door for the situation to occur. Can you talk about that one?
Yes, that was also a very thoughtful moment in the past, and clearly giving us an example that uh, you know we will make mistakes, and mistakes, or we will behave in a way that we will then feel sad about and guilty about. And that's what I felt about that report, that the person actually didn't interpret what the provider said, at least the way I understood that report, that the interpreter didn't do the precision, and when the provider said, well, don't interpret that part, the interpreter felt very uncomfortable but followed the provider's lead. And then now looking back on it, the interpreter realizes, well, both things were wrong, and I should have done the procession, and I should have still probably handled it in a different way. And the I like the recommendation is to realize that providers will not, or other parties, maybe patients too, obviously, will not always act the way we are used to them acting. They will make their own mistakes. They will not follow the rules, even if you do state things. Because even if this, let's say, interpreter had done the precession, the provider still could have made that comment, because it was a reflection of that provider's cultural competence and cultural sensitivity. And that's not something you can fix with one precession. But the way how you would handle that obviously is critical and different. And it's important to see, and I think by having these kind of reports in one place, and interpreters, both novice students of interpreting programs and experienced interpreters reading it, they will see that we have all these critical incidents on a daily basis in a variety of scenarios, and we need to be cognizant of them and address them, even so that we cannot change yesterday, but we can do better next time. So
In addition, in that particular scenario, the interpreter also assessed what she could do in the future. She identified one of her techniques, which she clearly um, labeled as not a standard way of handling. And this was where the interpreter was talking about how she might say to the provider or that person, give them the opportunity to uh, to 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 rephrase what they had said if the interpreter, I guess, felt that it was inappropriate and the way it had been said. Now, independently of judging her whether she's right in her manner of solving this, in her solution, I think that these rounds and these critical incidents reports are so valuable because just as language is not static, it's not frozen, it changes. I believe that interpreting as we move forward and we encounter all these different situations, the way that we do something today is perhaps not how we did it 20 years ago. And by having this interpreter being honest and said, this could be a way of resolving it. It may not be the accepted way or the best practice, but it puts it in the general continuum of possibilities that the experts can discuss in the upcoming panels. What do you think about that?
oh, absolutely, absolutely, because it's the hardest part is to prepare for the unknown, right? And by seeing how some people handle and struggle and figure out how would they handle it, we could find some good solutions for that we could apply in unknown situations, right? And then the other thing is that in this particular case, you know, I like her vulnerability of saying that I realize that this method is not an approved and accepted method, but we cannot predict and approve every method for every possible situation, right? If especially what last year taught us with COVID-19 pandemic, there are situations if doctors were in some facilities at the point of discussing of who would get a ventilator and who would not, right? And while it was, against all the other ethical norms of theirs to figure out, well, you'll just may have to disconnect that ventilator from that patient and give it to the other patient. So that is nobody prepared them. No school will have. And each, after reading this discussion, you'll see that different facility had different priorities. And then, there are different advocacy groups conflicting with them. So I think what we would achieve with the rounds is discussing these very difficult moments where right now they're not accepted and approved, but they could be a good moment to handle an unknown situation. That you handle it that way in that moment, and then you bring it back to the rounds, and we'll figure out what would be a better way. Because it's always best to do something about it than wing it and ignore it, because ignoring it makes it always worse. But addressing it in a way that shows that you noticed it and you care about it and you do something about it, at least that gives you you know the satisfaction of sleeping at night, right? I may not have done the best of the jobs, but I recognized this moment as a critical incident, and I addressed it in that moment that way. And then I'm going to think about it, and I'll do better next time. So, or differently, whatever I find the peers would recommend. So that, I think, is a very important opportunity for us to, as a profession, to ponder these situations and dilemmas.
Now, not all critical incidents are created equal. There may be some incidents which actually are at the cusp of having somebody be harmed by something that is done or not done. And yet we have others, like the example we had earlier of the parent who just added the information that the interpreter had omitted. I think it's really critical for us, using the word critical here, I think it's critical for interpreters to be able to distinguish the difference, but also to not set aside those things that they think are trivial, because they really may not be trivial in the long run. And by reviewing them and incorporating them into their thought process, that's another way that they can ensure that they're doing best practices. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I hope we'll get a lot of no harm reports, because we really don't want to get harmed, right? Our whole purpose is to facilitate communication, to make the life of the two parties easier. So that's why my prediction is the majority of our reports will be no harm. And the value would be in showing your critical thinking process, your actions in the moment, your assessment, and that would lay the foundation for newcomers to our profession to, see how it's done. Because, in a way, we're kind of an apprentice type profession when you learn interpreting translation, right? You're shown the model, you do it, you're given feedback. These are errors, like linguistic ones, wise, right? And the same thing is about critical thinking and applying ethics. Yes, we have the webinars, we have online training courses, but there's never enough, because it's living profession. So I think the actual discussion and showing of the no harm incident is more important, because that will prepare you for an incident when there could be potentially harm and you prevented it. And so that's the other type of incidents I hope we will reports I hope we will see, is the ones where the interpreter did the right thing, because we want to have both: the ones where you feel you didn't do something, but also when you did do something. And it especially would be interesting to see in the areas where there is this intersection of medical interpreting, healthcare interpreting, and other fields. That I think is where we would need a lot of that critical thinking practice before we could, really do a good job there. So because those are those gray areas are always hard.
So let's talk about some of those gray areas. I believe that one of those is workers' compensation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, among our certified interpreters, we have a pretty large cohort of interpreters who work mostly in workers' compensation. They don't work as staff interpreters at hospitals, and they are freelancers, but in a sense that a majority of their work is done in workers' comp cases, and they could be different things, including administrative hearings, but also evaluation, appointments, or sometimes even follow-up appointments, right? Physical therapy, etc. So it's a whole spectrum, which is very, clearly intersects with medical interpreting and healthcare interpreting. And here, I hope we will see incident reports from those interpreters as well, because it's one thing when you're interpreting for a person's physical therapy, which was, is paid by workers' compensation, proceedings, but then the same interpreter may step in for the same patient to the administrative hearing, which is the court interpreting uh, most of, especially with the speed they're talking, and you have to resort to a lot of simultaneous interpreting, and nobody really wants to clarify anything there, and they want you to do it so fast and leave it. And here you're getting into the area, which code of ethics am I following, right? Medical interpreter who will say, wait a minute, they need to do all my proper things here, or do I follow the court interpreter ethics? And when is that, what is the trigger of switching? Because to me, the whole point is like, I know you do both, right? I did court interpreting 2 appointments and then I was done for reasons that, I realized that, well, being neutral in court interpreting is much harder than in the medical interpreting. So adversarial setting is not for me, but I think of it as at some point there is a trigger that that tells you, okay, now it has to be the court interpreter hat. And what is that trigger? And I think through critical incident reports we can identify the incidents which become those triggers. A similar situation could be, for example, in interpreting an emergency room when the police officer comes in. Oh, and I also need to ask this person, because they're a victim of blah blah blah, some questions, right? And the different parameters of if you're a staff interpreter, if you're a freelancer. But ultimately, as medical interpreters, we definitely have different sets of rules. And if especially you never even did any interpretation for the police, which becomes a beginning of a case, or is a part of the case that will be tried in court potentially. So you are getting into the legal area. So I hope we hear a lot from interpreters who get into those practices like workers' comp, or into cases that have both, to tell us what helped them identify those challenges, and also pose questions, so that we could create policies. Because wouldn't it be nice if there would be a clear policy that is somewhere stored where it says medical interpreters do not interpret for police ever in the United States, right? Wouldn't that be nice? Then you don't have to have any ethical dilemmas. You just show to the police officer, here, that's what it says everywhere. And you won't even need to tell it to the police officer. The police officer will know that because it's everywhere. But until we get to that policy change and acceptance of the standard, we need to discuss it through the critical incidents reports and bring in experts, especially when we'll get those cases. The experts on the panels will be from court interpreting world, obviously, and from workers' compensation area, so that we find a solution that works for that particular setting, for that particular gray area, and not just judge everything from one side, the medical interpreting ethics code of ethics.
Now, as far as workers' compensation is concerned, there are some states which are creating some parameters for this.
Yes, like the state of California, right, leading the way. They have very, specific requirements. Of course, they also they have the Association of Interpreters who work in workers' compensation, but at the same time, there's still not a document that says, the code of ethics for interpreters and workers' compensation. And I don't know if we need it, but maybe we do. And maybe the fact that we don't have it, and we have court interpreters and medical, but not for workers' comp, that may be the weakness that we could address. Right. There's also the state of Colorado that is adopting the legislation requiring interpreters to be certified who work for workers' compensation cases. And obviously, the state is doing it to protect the injured workers because they deserve to have the highest quality of interpretation. And as we see, and of course in the state of Washington, there is a social services certification and exists, and they do have the state of Washington code of ethics that they are applying. So we have all these initiatives at the state level that it would be important for us nationally to know about and inform them and be informed by those initiatives as well.
Now, from the perspective of a legal interpreter, they often encounter situations which are quasi medical, quasi legal. Depositions often include topics that are healthcare related, independent medical examinations, mental health evaluations. So it really cuts both ways.
Absolutely. And, I've heard the stories when attorneys would use certified medical interpreters for depositions because it kind of is a medical case or injury case, right? But if that medical interpreter has never gotten any legal interpreter training, that's not quite right from my opinion, right? Because medical interpreters do not know what a deposition is. They don't have to know about that, right? So it's important because we again always both in the medical field, in the legal field, in the education field struggle with consumers of our services not understanding our role. uh, we need to educate them better and educate ourselves better, because there's nothing precluding medical interpreter for doing deposition, but and I know if they took the training, then they could definitely do it. But that's kind of that would be the trigger. I'm a freelance medical certified medical interpreter. I'm called to interpret for a deposition. Oops, I need to get online training about interpreting depositions before I can accept that appointment. And that could be, the situations. And if there's a legal interpreter who is doing a deposition, they know what they're doing. But if that same legal interpreter steps into a doctor's appointment where they may need to apply more medical interpreting code of ethics rather than the legal one, they also need to get training. So those critical incidents maybe will show us that some of them are because individuals are crossing settings without the proper training. Because I know, of course, we're doing this podcast for De La Mora Institute, and I know there was a training, a crossover training for medical and legal interpreters a couple of years ago started, and I really appreciated that because without, when you're ignorant, you're making worse errors than when you know things. Please, then you can catch, ooh, something went wrong, and I can report it.
Absolutely. So, Natalia, this is your opportunity to speak directly to our listeners and interpreters out there from all sectors and get them to participate in this program.
Well, and I appreciate this opportunity. I really would like to encourage all interpreters, especially the ones who are certified, to truly submit at least one report a year, because I know you have more than one incident a year. When I used to interpret more often, almost every day they would be like, there's something in the back of my mind, like, oh, I wish I did it differently. So like, oh, next time I will. That's the teaching moment for somebody, and it's a learning moment for you. So we at CCHI, if you're certified through CCHI, we award one continuing education unit for you just for submitting this report in, of course, complete report. And then if your report is chosen for being discussed by panelists during the interpreter rounds, then you get an additional continuing education interpreter unit. Because what I think we sometimes don't, we forget that continuing education is not just online training, listening, being passive consumer of knowledge. It's sharing your knowledge, right? Instructors do it when they teach something, and everyone can do it when they submit this critical incident report. So go to our website, cchicertification.org, and on the homepage at the bottom, click the link and fill out the report. There are about over 4,500 certified interpreters in the United States by CCHI alone, right? If one submits one report, by the end of this year, we'll have 4,500 reports. We'll have so much rich material that trainers could use, that we could use. It'll be amazing. So let's at least shoot for 1,000 this year. How's that?
And by all means, it doesn't have to be limited to CCHI interpreters. It could be CMI interpreters. It could be legal interpreters. Anybody who's ever had a question or an critical incident that has left them thinking about these types of situations and would like to either think about it some more or have their peers give them some feedback. So this isn't restricted to just CCHI.
And it's not restricted to spoken languages either, or sign language interpreters. I know, you have your own mechanisms of discussing this, but we want to learn from you too, so that's why this is open for anybody and for interpreters who are not certified yet. Because, what we want to see, we want to actually, as if you think in the medical field, the Joint Commission collects those critical incident reports from every accredited hospital, right? And then they run analysis, and then they create different policies. Like, for example, ask several times whether it's left kidney or right kidney we're going to take out today, right? So they established all these policies based on the analysis of the critical incident reports. And they find these simple solutions as asking 3 times or whatever many times to confirm what they're supposed to do. Same thing with us. If we will run an analysis at the end of every year, and we'll see that the majority of incident reports are about ethics and XYZ, right? Then we will reach out, throw all our resources at it. We'll reach out to trainers, we'll reach out to associations, to national council, to create some guidances for that. Because right now we don't know what are the most frequent incidents that we experience. We're a very intimate profession, right? One-on-one with people, and this is our opportunity in a safe, professional and thorough manner and systematic manner to discuss this and come up with solutions.
Natalya Mytareva, thank you so much for joining us here on Subject to Interpretation. It's been a pleasure.
Well, Maria, thank you very much. And also thank you for Subject to Interpretation to invite me.
We hope this podcast has enriched your journey along this fascinating field of interpretation. We hope you've learned something new. Thank you for joining us here. If you are watching us on YouTube, please comment below. And if you're listening to us on one of our audio podcast platforms, please subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. Thank you for joining us. Take care.